Tonight, we're diving deep into the full history of the Poké Ball, from the humble apricorn to the perfect sphere that no Pokémon has ever escaped. Thank you to those of you who have been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment day 1. Now, let's get back to the video. Close your eyes for a moment and picture something so small it fits in the palm of a hand. Something so ordinary that trainers clip 6 of them to a belt and forget they are there. A sphere. Red on top, white below, a thin dark seam running across its middle, like the horizon line of a world folded in on itself. You have seen it 1,000 times. You have seen it in the hands of children on their 10th birthday, standing at the edge of a field of tall grass, with their hearts pounding in their throats. You have seen it in the gloved fingers of champions beneath stadium lights, held up to the roar of tens of thousands. You have seen it rolling in the dust of a battlefield, cracked and dark, its light gone out. It is the single most recognizable object in the entire Pokémon world, and almost nobody stops to ask what it actually is. Tonight, we are going to ask. Because beneath that cheerful, candy-bright shell lies one of the strangest technologies ever devised by human hands. A device that can take a living creature weighing 460 kilograms, a creature of muscle and bone and beating heart, and reduce it in an instant to a beam of red light no thicker than a thread. A device that can hold that creature suspended in something that is neither sleep nor death, for a day, for a year, for a century, without food, without water, without air. A device that has been used so many billions of times that no one questions it anymore, the way no one questions a doorknob or a light bulb. And yet if you slow down, if you let the world go quiet and really consider what a Pokéball does, the ground begins to shift beneath you. Where did it come from? Not the factory, not the Silphco assembly line in Saffron City, with its conveyor belts and its quality control lasers. Before all that, before the corporations and the trademarks and the mass production, before the vending machines in department stores that dispense them like sodas. Go back past the Great Ball and the Ultra Ball, past the Master Ball sitting in its velvet case behind glass. Go back past the aluminum and the polymer and the magnetic coupling, back through centuries of refinement, and you arrive somewhere very different. You arrive in a forest in the Johto region, in the hills near a village that would one day be called Azalea Town, where the trees grow crooked and low, and the light comes down green through the canopy. And hanging from those trees, heavy on their stems, are fruit. Not the sweet berries that trainers press into medicine. Something harder, something almost woody, the size of a fist, with a rind so thick you could not bite through it if you tried. The people of that region called them apricorns, and for a very long time they were nothing more than a nuisance. A fruit too tough to eat, dropping onto forest paths and rolling underfoot. You can almost feel that forest around you now. The damp of the soil. The smell of moss and bark and rain that fell 3 days ago and never quite dried. The sound of something moving in the underbrush, small and cautious, watching the humans pass. In those days, humans and Pokémon lived close to one another, but not together. Not the way we understand it now. There were no partnerships. There were no trainers. There were only 2 kinds of creature sharing one world, one of them soft and slow and clever, the other fast and strong and utterly beyond control. A human who wandered too far from the fire at night did not always come back. A human who met a Pokémon on the road hoped that it was in a good mood. And so the first question that ever led to the Pokéball was not how do we make friends, it was how do we survive. Consider what it must have been like. You are standing at the edge of a field at dusk with a spear tipped in flint, and something is moving through the grass toward you that can breathe fire. Not metaphorically, not as a story told to frighten children. It can open its mouth and produce flame hot enough to turn sand into glass. What do? You run, and it is faster. You climb, and it can fly. You hide, and it can smell the salt on your skin from 100 meters away. There is no weapon in the human arsenal at that point in history that can meaningfully answer a creature like that. Stone cannot. Bronze cannot. Even much later, when steel came and armies marched with blades and armor, the truth remained the same. A single well-trained Pokémon could break a company of soldiers, and everyone knew it. So humanity did what humanity always does when it cannot win by force. It got clever. The oldest stories, the ones scratched into cave walls and pressed into clay, long before anyone thought to write them down, do not speak of catching Pokémon. They speak of asking, of offering. There are carvings in the Sinnoh Highlands, in caverns where the air is so still that your own breath sounds loud, that show human figures kneeling before Pokémon figures with their arms outstretched, holding something up. Food, perhaps, or something more precious. And in some of those carvings, the Pokémon has bent its head down toward the offering, and in others, it has not. The stone does not record what happened after. But somewhere in that long negotiation between fear and need, someone in the forests of Johto picked up an apricorn. Here is what makes that fruit remarkable, and here is where the whole story begins to turn. An apricorn is hollow, not entirely, not when it is fresh, but as it ripens, the flesh inside dries and pulls away from the rind, and what you are left with is a hard shell with a cavity in the center and a few dry seeds rattling around like the clapper in a bell. You can hear it if you shake one. That sound, that dry rattle in the green quiet of the woods, is arguably the first note in the entire history of Pokémon training. The people of that region began to use them as containers. There is nothing mystical about this. It is the most ordinary thing in the world. You find a hollow object, you cut it open, you put things in it. They carried water in them, and seeds, and medicine ground from bark. They carried embers wrapped in damp leaves so that a fire could be moved from one camp to another without dying. An apricorn cut cleanly in half and hinged with a strip of hide made a perfectly good box, and it was waterproof, and it floated, and it was free, and it grew on trees. And then someone noticed the other thing. Not all apricorns are alike. Walk through those Johto woods long enough, and you will find that they come in colors, and that the colors are not random. There are red ones on the sun-facing slopes, where the soil is dry and the light is hard. There are blue ones near water, hanging over streams and pools, their skins cool to the touch even at noon. There are yellow ones that seem to grow only where lightning has struck, in the burned clearings, on the scorched ridges. Green ones deep in the shade. White ones in the high, thin air of the mountains, and black ones in the hollows where the sun does not reach, and pink ones, rarest of all, in the meadows where flowers grow thick enough to walk on. 7 colors, 7 kinds of place, and the old craftsmen, the ones who spent their whole lives among those trees, began to insist on something that outsiders found ridiculous. They said the fruit remembered. They said an apricorn that grew in the lightning-struck clearings carried some trace of that lightning in it. That a blue apricorn hanging over a stream had spent its whole existence listening to water, and had become, in some small way, watery itself. That the fruit was not merely a container, but a kind of vessel, shaped by the land that made it, and that if you put the right thing inside the right shell, something would happen. This is the part that modern engineers dismiss and cannot explain away, because it works. Even now, thousands of years later, in a world of orbital satellites and quantum storage systems, there is an old man in Azalea Town who takes apricorns from your hand and carves them by lamplight, and the balls he makes do things that no factory-produced sphere can do. A ball carved from black apricorn is heavy in a way that has nothing to do with its mass, and it makes a Pokémon sluggish the moment it is released, as though the creature had walked out of the shell into deep water. A ball carved from red apricorn works better at night, and no one has ever satisfactorily explained why. A ball carved from white apricorn has a strange affinity for creatures that live in the water and for creatures that burrow beneath the earth, 2 habitats that share nothing except that both are places where a human being cannot easily follow. Silphco has studied these. They have taken them apart. They have subjected them to spectroscopy and stress testing and every analytical method their laboratories possess, and the reports all say the same thing in different words. The material is organic. The material is inert. There is no mechanism, and the balls work anyway. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In those first centuries, no apricorn caught anything. They were bowls and bottles and boxes, nothing more. The leap from container to capture device required something else entirely, and that something else did not come from a workshop. It came from a temple. Let your mind travel now from the low green woods of Johto to somewhere harder and colder, to a mountainside in the deep interior, where the trees give up and the stone begins, and the wind comes down off the peaks, with a sound like something breathing. There are ruins there. There are ruins in every region if you know where to look, but these are older than most, and they are strange in a particular way. They are built of blocks so large that no crane in the modern world could lift them, fitted together so precisely that a knife blade cannot slide between them, and they are decorated, floor to ceiling, with a script that nobody can read. The unknown script. Those thin, angular figures that resemble letters, but refuse to resolve into meaning. You have seen them. Everyone has seen them. They writhe across the walls of the ruins of Alf and the Solaceon ruins, and half a dozen other sites scattered across the world, and every generation of scholars announces that they have finally cracked it, and every generation is quietly wrong. What the ruins do show, unambiguously, in carvings that require no translation, are humans and Pokémon together, in a relationship that looks nothing like ownership and nothing like war. The figures stand side by side, they face the same direction, and between them, again and again, at the center of the composition, there is a sphere. Not a Poké Ball. Not the red and white design that would come much later. A sphere, plain and unmarked, sometimes shown with lines radiating outward from it like a sun, sometimes shown split into two halves with something indistinct in the space between them. The archaeologists call it the vessel motif. It appears in Sinnoh, it appears in Johto. It appears, in a slightly different style, on the walls of the ruins of life, in the Hoenn Desert, thousands of kilometers away, across an ocean, carved by people who by every measure of history could never have met. That is the detail that should keep you awake, and I say that gently, on a night when I am trying to help you sleep. 3 civilizations that had no contact with one another, separated by seas that none of them had the ships to cross, all arrived at the same image. A sphere between a human and a Pokémon, a sphere that means something. The most conservative interpretation is that the sphere is symbolic, a representation of unity, of the world, of the sun, of the egg from which everything came. Circles are the easiest shape to draw and the easiest to invest with meaning, and cultures all over the world have used them without needing to have spoken to one another. The less conservative interpretation is that the sphere is a sphere, that these people were describing an object they had actually seen, and that somewhere in the deep past, before recorded history, before the Poké Ball was invented, something round and small had already been used to hold a Pokémon inside it. Hold that thought. Let it sit in the back of your mind, like a stone in a shoe, because we will come back to it, and when we do, it will be much heavier than it seems right now. What we can say with more confidence is that the first true capture devices, the ones we can trace and date and hold in our hands in museum cases, were not made of apricorn at all, they were made of pottery. In the earliest days of Kanto and Johto, before the regions had those names, there were clay vessels, not spheres, jars, sealed pots with narrow necks and heavy lids, and they were used in a practice that we would not recognize as Pokémon training, and would probably find disturbing if we saw it. The pots were not built to carry Pokémon around. They were built to keep them in one place, to bind them. The practice appears in fragments across a dozen cultures. A village plagued by something in the night, something that killed livestock or sickened children, or made the wells run bitter, would call for a specialist, not a warrior, a specialist, someone who knew the old words. That person would perform whatever rites their tradition demanded, and at the end of it, if things went well, the trouble would be sealed inside a jar, and the jar would be buried at a crossroads, or sunk in a lake, or walled into the foundation of a shrine, and the village would be at peace. We have found those jars. Some of them are still sealed. Nobody has opened one. There is a storeroom beneath a museum in Johto, climate-controlled, humidity-monitored, where 11 of them sit on padded shelves behind a door that requires 2 keys held by 2 different people. The official position is that they are archaeologically significant artifacts whose contents would be destroyed by exposure to air, and that opening them would be an act of vandalism against the historical record. That is a completely reasonable position, and it is almost certainly true. It is also true that the curators do not like to work down there alone. Now, whether anything was ever really bound inside those jars is a question that scholarship cannot answer, and probably should not try to. What matters for our purposes is the idea, because the idea is the seed of everything that follows. The idea that a Pokémon, a creature of flesh and will and enormous power, can be made to occupy a container smaller than itself. That is not an obvious thought. It is not the kind of thought that occurs naturally to a person looking at a Tauros. Somebody, somewhere, thousands of years ago, looked at a living creature, and looked at a clay pot, and made a connection between them that had no right to exist. And the strangest part is that they were right. Between the sealed jars and the first apricorn balls lies a gap of centuries that history has largely lost. We have scraps. We have a burial site in the Johto uplands, where a body was interred with 3 hollowed apricorns arranged around the skull. The shells cut and rejoined with resin. The seams sealed with something that analysis identifies as a mixture of pine sap, powdered mineral, and blood. We have a wooden tablet, waterlogged and barely legible, recovered from a peat bog, on which somebody recorded what appears to be a transaction. So many measures of grain for so many shells. The shells are described with a word that does not appear anywhere else in the surviving language, and translators have rendered it, with a great deal of hedging, as sleeping houses. Sleeping houses. Think about that word for a moment, in the dark, as you drift. Whoever made those first balls did not think of them as prisons or as tools. They thought of them as places where something could rest. And perhaps that is the closest anyone has ever come to describing what actually happens inside a Poké Ball. Because here is what we know, and here is where the calm surface of this story begins to ripple. When a Pokémon is inside a ball, it is not asleep in any medical sense. Its brain, if it has one in a form we would recognize, is not producing the rhythms of sleep. Its heart is not beating slowly. Its heart is not beating at all, because at that moment it does not have one. The creature is not compressed. It is not miniaturized. Repeated experiments have confirmed that no matter what goes into a ball, the ball's mass changes by an amount so small that the finest instruments in the world have never reliably measured it. A Wailord weighs 398 kilograms. A Poké Ball containing a Wailord weighs the same as a Poké Ball containing nothing at all. So where does it go? The energy conversion theory, which is what every school child is taught, says that the Pokémon is transformed into energy and stored as a pattern within the ball's internal matrix. This is elegant, and it explains the red light, and it is almost certainly incomplete, because the amount of energy released by converting a large animal into pure energy would not gently illuminate a forest clearing. It would remove the forest. It would remove the clearing. It would remove the trainer, the town beyond the trees, and a substantial portion of the surrounding countryside. Every capture would be a catastrophe, and yet a 10-year-old can do it on a Tuesday afternoon and go home for dinner, which means the mass is not being converted. It is being moved. And that raises the only question that really matters, the one that sits underneath every other question in this entire history, the one that the Silphco annual report does not address and the Pokémon League licensing exam does not ask. Moved where? Rest there for a moment. Let the question float. We are going to walk all the way down into it, but not yet, not tonight, not while the forest is still young and the shells are still hanging on their stems, waiting for the hands that will carve them. Let us go back to those hands. The apricorn craft, as it developed in Johto, was not an industry. It was closer to a priesthood, and it was very nearly lost. There were never many practitioners, perhaps a few dozen families at the height of it, and they were concentrated in the hill country, where the trees grew, and they did not travel, and they did not write things down. Everything they knew was passed from a pair of hands to a younger pair of hands over a period of years, in a workshop that smelled of sap and scorched wood, in a silence broken only by the sound of a blade going into a rind. The process, as it is still practiced today by the very last of them, begins long before the carving. It begins with the picking, and the picking has rules. You do not take an apricorn that has fallen. A fallen apricorn has finished. Whatever it was going to become, it has become, and the thing inside it has already begun to go quiet. You take them from the branch, and you take them at the moment when the rind has hardened but the stem has not yet started to dry, and there is a window of perhaps 4 days in the whole year when a given tree is ready. Miss it, and you wait until the next season. You do not take more than 1 in 3 from any tree. This is stated as a practical matter of conservation, and it is that, but the old carvers do not phrase it practically. They say the tree needs to keep enough of itself to remember what it is. You do not pick in the rain. You do not pick at midday. You do not pick a fruit that another person has already touched, and if you drop one, you leave it where it lands. And when you carry them home, you carry them in an open basket, never a sealed bag, because a shell that is going to be a sleeping house should not spend its first hours in the dark. Every one of these rules can be explained away. Wet fruit is harder to cure. Midday heat splits the rind. A dropped apricorn is bruised and will crack on the lathe, and the old carvers will nod along politely while you explain their own craft to them, and then they will go on doing it exactly as they always have, because they know something that they cannot demonstrate and will not argue about. The carving itself takes a day for a simple ball and a week for a good one. The shell is cut along a line that the carver chooses by feel, turning the fruit over and over in their hands until they find the place where it wants to open. They insist that this place is different on every apricorn, and that if you cut anywhere else, the ball will never seat properly, no matter how precise your work. Then the interior is scraped out, layer by layer, down to a thickness that is measured not with a caliper, but by holding the shell up to a candle and watching the light come through. When the glow is even all the way around, with no bright spots and no shadows, you stop. Then the shell is cured, slowly, in smoke, for anywhere from 3 days to a month depending on the color. And the smoke is made from wood of the same species that bore the fruit, so that the shell spends its curing breathing something familiar. During this time, the carver does not leave the workshop for long, and does not let the fire go out, and in the older tradition, did not speak to anyone at all until the work was finished. Only at the very end is the mechanism fitted. And the mechanism, in a hand-carved apricorn ball, is almost nothing. A spring, a catch, a small pressure plate on the front face. There is no circuitry, there is no power source. There is nothing in that shell that any physicist can point to and say, this is the part that does the impossible thing. And it does the impossible thing anyway. Kurt is the name of the man who still makes them, and his family has been making them in Azalea Town for as long as Azalea Town has had a name, and probably longer. He is not a wealthy man. He could be. There are collectors who would pay extraordinary sums for a single level ball or a lure ball with his mark on the base, and there are corporations that have sent representatives to his door with contracts and offers of laboratory space and lifetime royalties. He turns them all down, politely, and goes back to his lathe. He takes apricorns from trainers, one at a time, and he makes one ball per apricorn, and he will not be hurried, and he will not make 2 of the same kind in a row. When he was asked, once, why he does not simply teach the process to others and let it be produced properly, he is supposed to have said that he would be happy to teach it to anyone willing to spend 40 years learning it. And then he said something else, more quietly, that the interviewer recorded but never really followed up on. He said that the balls come out different depending on who carves them, and that he did not fully understand why, and that he had made a few over the years that he had chosen not to sell. He did not say what was wrong with them. He did not say where they are now. And the interview moved on to questions about tourism in Azalea Town, and the moment passed, and nobody has ever gone back to ask. But if you ever find yourself in that part of Johto, in the low green hills where the slowpokes sit, at the edges of the wells, and the whole town seems to move at half speed, you will notice that the workshop has a second room. It is behind the main floor, past the drying racks and the barrels of shavings, and the door to it is closed. It is always closed. Visitors are not shown it, and nobody in Azalea Town finds this strange, in the way that people who live beside something strange for long enough stop being able to see it at all. Title formats for niche. TXT. Let us leave that door closed for now, because while the carvers of Johto were shaping their sleeping houses one at a time in the smoke and the quiet, something entirely different was beginning to happen a few hundred kilometers to the west, in a city of glass and steel that had decided the future should be manufactured. The transition from apricorn to industry is usually told as a triumph. It is taught in schools as a story about progress, about a brilliant engineer who looked at a hand-carved wooden shell and thought, we can do better than this. And in the narrowest sense, that is exactly what happened. But the story has a shape to it that is worth slowing down for, because the truth is that the industrial Poké Ball was not invented so much as reverse-engineered from something nobody understood, and the people who did it knew that at the time, and they did it anyway. Picture Saffron City before Silphco was Silphco, a trading town at a crossroads, growing fast, full of workshops and warehouses, and the noise of people building things badly and quickly. Somewhere in that town, in a rented room above a shop, a small group of engineers had gotten hold of a set of apricorn balls and had done what engineers do. They had cut them open. What they found frustrated them enormously. A hollow shell of cured organic material, a spring, a catch, a pressure plate, nothing that could account for the observed behavior, which was that a creature the size of a horse could be induced to enter this object and remain there indefinitely without dying. The engineers measured everything they could measure. They weighed the balls empty and full. They tested the shells for radioactivity, for magnetic properties, for unusual conductivity, and found nothing outside the range you would expect from a piece of dried fruit. And then one of them, whose name has been lost because he was junior and because the records from that period are a mess, suggested something that in retrospect changed the world. He suggested that they stop trying to find the mechanism and start trying to find the shape. If you cannot understand why a thing works, copy it exactly. Copy the interior volume, copy the wall thickness, copy the ratio between the upper hemisphere and the lower. Copy the curvature of the seam, the position of the catch, the tension of the spring, the precise depth of the concavity, where the pressure plate sits. Copy it in metal, in glass, in ceramic, in every material you can machine, and see which ones still do the impossible thing. Most of them did not. This is a detail that gets skipped in the official histories, and it is the most interesting thing about the entire industrial period. The early prototypes overwhelmingly failed. A ball machined out of brass, to tolerances 100 times finer than any hand-carved shell, would simply sit there, inert, while a rattata walked past it. A ball blown from glass, to the exact same interior dimensions, did nothing. A ball cast in iron did nothing. The engineers went through hundreds of materials and hundreds of failures, and were, by every account, close to abandoning the project entirely. What finally worked was not a material at all, it was a coating. Somewhere in the middle of that long series of failures, someone tried lining the interior of a metal shell with a thin layer of ground apricorn husk suspended in resin. Just a film of it, barely thicker than a coat of paint, applied to the inside surface where nothing would ever see it. And the ball worked. Not as well as a hand-carved one. It took 3 throws where a carved shell would have taken 1. But it worked, and it kept working, and it could be produced by the 100. Think about what that means. Think about it slowly, because it is the hinge on which everything else turns. Every mass-produced Poké Ball that has ever been made, every red and white sphere in every shop in every region, from the cheapest bulk bin model to the finest tournament-grade Ultra Ball, contains a trace of that original forest. The formula has been refined. The apricorn content has been reduced again and again as processes improved, down to a fraction of a percent, and then to parts per thousand, and in the most modern designs, to a whisper of organic residue that a chemist would have to look hard to find. But it has never gone to zero. It cannot go to zero. Silphco has tried, more than once, for reasons that are entirely about supply chains and cost and have nothing to do with reverence. And every fully synthetic ball they have ever produced has been a dead sphere of plastic that no Pokémon has ever entered. The trees are still in there, every single one of them. Billions of spheres, all over the world, each one carrying a memory of a hillside in Johto that most of them will never see. The first commercial Poké Ball went on sale to the general public at a price that would have bought a week of food. It was heavy, roughly 2.5 times the mass of a modern ball, and it was not red and white. It was plain steel with a brass seam, and it had to be primed before use by winding a small key set into the lower hemisphere, and if you forgot to prime it, which everyone did, it would bounce off a Pidgey and roll away into the grass and be lost. It sold out immediately. Not because it was good. It was not good. It was because for the first time in the history of the world, a person who was not born into a carving family and did not live in the hill country and had no connection to the old traditions could walk into a shop with money in their hand and walk out with the ability to travel alongside a creature that could burn down a building. The apricorn carvers had made perhaps a few hundred balls a year between all of them, and those balls went to specialists, to rangers and researchers and the wealthy. The steel ball with the winding key went to anybody. That is the moment the modern world begins. Not with the invention, with the price tag. And the consequences arrived faster than anyone was prepared for. Within a generation, the population of wild Pokémon in the accessible lowlands of Kanto and Johto had visibly declined. Not because of cruelty, particularly, though there was some of that, simply because of arithmetic. When 100 people can catch, the wild absorbs it. When 100,000 people can catch, it does not. Entire species that had been common enough to be considered pests along the eastern routes became scarce within 20 years, and a few of them became stories. Old people in coastal Kanto still describe a small ground-dwelling Pokémon, brown and burrowing, that they say used to turn up in every garden in the region when they were children, and which no modern Pokédex has an entry for. The official position is that they are misremembering a Diglett. The old people are quite firm that they are not. The response, when it came, was the first great legal architecture of the Pokémon world, and its scars are still visible in every rule that governs training today. Catch limits. The 6 Pokémon carry restriction, which most trainers assume is a matter of practicality or fairness in battle, and which was in fact a conservation measure written in a panic by legislators watching the routes empty out. Licensing. The minimum age. The registration of every capture to a central system, which is why your Pokédex reports to a professor, and why that professor reports to a regional authority. The whole apparatus of the league, that vast tournament structure that looks like sport, grew out of a regulatory body whose original job was to decide who was allowed to own a Poké Ball at all. And underneath all of that, quietly, a philosophical problem that the law has never resolved and mostly prefers not to examine. The old carvers had a rule that they applied to their own work, and it was not written anywhere, and it was not enforceable, and it went like this: a sleeping house is offered, not thrown. They meant it literally. In the tradition as it was practiced in the hill country, you did not hurl a ball at a Pokémon. You set it down on the ground in front of the creature, and you stepped back, and you waited. If the Pokémon pressed the plate, it pressed the plate. If it did not, you picked your ball up at the end of the day and went home and tried again, or did not. That method still works. It has never stopped working. A ball placed on the ground and touched voluntarily by a Pokémon produces a capture with a success rate that approaches certainty, regardless of the creature's strength, regardless of its health, regardless of whether it is a Caterpie or something with a shrine built to it. There is no resistance, because there is nothing to resist. The mechanism is not fighting anything, and essentially nobody does it, because it requires patience measured in weeks, and because the Pokémon usually says no, and because there is a much faster method available, which is to weaken the creature until it cannot refuse. That is what a battle before a capture actually is, when you strip the sport away from it. It is a negotiation conducted at speed, in which one party has all of the leverage. The ball is still asking. It asks every single time. The red light that flickers over a wild Pokémon at the moment of contact is, by every measurement that Silphco has ever taken, a query, and the shake of the ball on the ground is the creature answering it, and the click is the answer settling into yes. A healthy, uninjured, unafraid Pokémon says no. An exhausted one that has been struck until it can no longer stand, one that is paralyzed or asleep or burning, is far more likely to say yes. Not because the ball has become stronger, but because the will that would have refused has been worn thin. The industry does not phrase it this way. The industry uses the word catch rate and expresses it as a coefficient and prints it on the packaging, and it is a very useful number that tells you precisely nothing about what it is measuring. But every trainer who has ever thrown a ball at a creature that was still standing tall and watched it burst back out in a flash of white light has felt the truth of it, whether or not they put words to the feeling. They have been refused. Something looked at the offer and declined. And there are Pokémon that refuse forever. You know some of their names. There is a certain fire-breathing bird in the skies over Johto that trainers have been throwing balls at for as long as balls have existed, and there is a lake in Sinnoh with something sleeping under it that has watched 1,000 spheres sink past it into the dark, and there are stories from every region of the same shape. The creature does not fight, it does not flee, it simply is not caught, and the ball opens again, and the light comes back out, and the trainer stands there in the sudden silence, understanding for the first time that the technology they have relied on their entire life has an upper limit, and they have just found it. Which brings us, inevitably, to the ball that has no upper limit. But not yet. Before we climb that high, we have to walk through everything in between, because the shelves of the modern world are full of spheres, and each one of them is an answer to a specific problem, and the problems are more interesting than the answers. Start with the Great Ball, blue and red, with 2 white bands running down its face like the marks on a bird's wing. It is the second rung of the ladder, the first upgrade every trainer buys, and it is such a mundane object that nobody ever asks what makes it better. The answer is not more apricorn residue, and it is not a stronger mechanism. It is timing. A standard Poké Ball asks its question once, all at once, in a single pulse at the moment of contact. A Great Ball asks in stages. The initial pulse is weaker, deliberately, gently, a lighter touch on the creature's awareness, and then the mechanism holds and asks again a fraction of a second later, and again, 3 times over the space of about 2 seconds. This is why a great ball shakes with a different rhythm, slower and heavier, and why experienced trainers can tell what kind of ball is on the ground with their eyes shut. It is not overpowering the Pokémon, it is being persistent with it. It is the difference between a shout and a conversation. The Ultra Ball goes further in the same direction and adds something else, which is discrimination. Inside an Ultra Ball's shell, there is a small yellow band that most people assume is decorative, and it is not. It is the external housing of a sensor array that reads the target before the query is sent, sampling whatever it is that a ball samples and adjusting the shape of the pulse to match. This is why an Ultra Ball is disproportionately effective on unusual creatures, on the rare and the strange, and the ones that do not fit the standard profile. It listens first. It works out what it is talking to, and then it phrases the question in a way that particular creature is more likely to understand. That sensor array is also the reason Ultra Balls cost what they cost, and the reason they occasionally fail catastrophically on Pokémon so anomalous that the array cannot classify them at all. There are documented cases from Alola, from the period when things were coming through holes in the sky, of Ultra Balls simply refusing to activate. The trainer throws, the ball strikes, and nothing happens. No light, no shake. The sphere just falls to the ground and lies there, and when it is recovered later, the sensor housing is found to be blank and unresponsive, as though it had been asked to measure something and had quietly declined to look at it. That is worth sitting with, a machine that will not report what it saw. Then there are the specialists, and here the story becomes almost gentle, because the specialist balls are where the craft tradition and the industrial tradition finally shake hands. There is a ball that works better on Pokémon you have already recorded in your Pokédex, and its mechanism is nothing more than a memory. It carries a copy of your research data, and it matches the target against that data, and if it finds a match, it borrows the profile of every previous encounter to shape its query. Familiarity, made into an object. The more you know a species, the more easily the ball speaks to it, which is not a metaphor, it is a specification. There is a ball that works better at night and in caves, and its mechanism is even simpler. It measures ambient light. In darkness, it lengthens the query, holds the pulse a fraction longer, because whoever designed it understood something about how a creature responds when it cannot see the thing that is asking. There is a ball that grows more effective the longer a battle has lasted. There is a ball that becomes almost irresistible when the Pokémon you are facing is the same species as the Pokémon standing at your side. There is one made for use on water, and one that heals whatever it holds a little more with every step its owner takes, and one that is worth an enormous amount of money and does nothing at all except look beautiful, which some collectors will tell you is not nothing. And there is one, rarely mentioned, that was designed for the sole purpose of returning a Pokémon to the wild. It has no catch function. It is a ball that only opens. It exists because researchers needed a way to release creatures that had been held for study without the trauma of a manual ejection, and because somebody in that laboratory understood that the way a thing ends matters as much as the way it begins. They are not sold in shops. You will not find one in a department store. But they exist in the back rooms of research stations, and when they are used, the light that comes out of them is not red. It is white, and it is slower, and the Pokémon that steps out of it does not look back. Now let us descend, slowly, into the question we left floating in the dark a while ago. The one about where the mass goes. We have circled it long enough, and the night is deep enough now, and there is nothing left between us and it but the walking. Tactique-free transcript 8E 5W QRY 6UE ties2.txt. Here is the problem stated plainly. A Snorlax weighs 460 kilograms. That is not an estimate. It is a measured figure, recorded thousands of times, remarkably consistent across the species. 460 kilograms of muscle and fat and bone and whatever else is in there. A Poké Ball, empty, weighs a little under 300 grams. A Poké Ball containing a Snorlax weighs a little under 300 grams. You can hold one in your palm, you can toss it and catch it, you can put it in a coat pocket and forget about it. The matter has not been destroyed, because destroying it would release energy on a scale that would erase the region. The matter has not been compressed, because there is no known force that compresses a living organism into a volume the size of a walnut without killing it, and Pokémon come out of balls alive, unhurt, and frequently annoyed. The matter has not been converted into information and stored, because information requires a medium, and the medium in question is a hollow shell with a spring in it. So the matter has gone somewhere else, It has left. It has been moved out of the world we are standing in, and into somewhere that is not this world, and the ball is not a container at all. The ball is a door. This is not a fringe theory. It is, quietly, the working assumption of every serious researcher in the field, and it has been for a very long time. It is simply not the language used in the marketing materials, because the marketing materials would then have to explain what is on the other side of the door, and nobody can. There are theories. There are always theories. The first and most comfortable is the pocket dimension model. The ball generates a small, sealed bubble of space, folded off from ordinary reality, with a volume of a few cubic meters, and no exits except the one it came from. The Pokémon is transferred into this bubble and remains there, and because the bubble is not part of our universe, its contents do not register on our scales. This is tidy. It explains the mass. It explains why the ball works no matter what size the creature is, because a bubble that can hold a Rattata can just as easily be made to hold a Wailord, and it explains the phrase that the old carvers used, sleeping house, better than the carvers could possibly have known, a small room, somewhere else, where something rests. The trouble with the pocket dimension model is that it requires the ball to create a dimension, not access one. Create one, from nothing, on demand, in a fraction of a second, using a spring and a catch and a smear of powdered fruit. The energy requirements for that operation, calculated honestly, are somewhere between absurd and blasphemous. Which leads to the second theory, and the second theory is the one that makes people uncomfortable. The ball does not create the space. The space is already there. The ball simply knows how to knock. Under this model, there is one destination, not billions. Every Poké Ball on the planet opens onto the same place. It is not a bubble made for the occasion. It is somewhere that existed long before anyone carved a fruit, somewhere adjacent to our reality. And the apricorn trees grew in a part of the world where the boundary is thin, and their fruit absorbed a property of that thinness, and human beings noticed and made use of it without ever once understanding what they were making use of. If that is true, then every Pokémon ever caught, in every region, throughout the whole of recorded history, has been sent to the same place. And the follow-up question is not one anybody wants to ask out loud on a quiet night. Are they there together? The official answer, the reassuring one, is no, and it comes with evidence. A Pokémon recalled after 10 minutes, and a Pokémon recalled after 10 years, both emerge in exactly the state they entered. No hunger, no thirst, no muscle loss, no aging, or at least none that has ever been measured. Creatures released from balls that had been sealed for a century, recovered from shipwrecks and collapsed buildings, and one very famous case involving a bank vault, have come out healthy and confused and looking for a trainer who died decades ago. That last detail is usually reported as heartwarming. Loyalty across time, the bond that outlasts a lifetime. Sit with it a moment longer and it stops being heartwarming. Because if no time passed, then from the creature's perspective, there was no interval at all. It went in and it came out, and the gap between those two moments did not exist. The world simply changed around it in the space of a blink. The town was different, the trees were taller, the person it knew was gone, and nobody could explain where, and there had been no goodbye because from where it was standing, there had been no time in which to say one. We tell ourselves that being in a ball is like sleeping. It is not like sleeping. Sleep has duration, sleep has dreams, and shifting, and the slow surfacing toward morning. This is something else. This is a gap in existence, and the creature falls across it, without knowing it is falling, and every recall is a small erasure of a piece of a life. 6 Pokémon on a belt. A trainer walks 20 kilometers in a day, sees 3 towns, has a conversation that changes her mind about something important, watches the sun go down over water. 5 of those 6 were not there. They were nowhere. They will step out into a world that has moved 20 kilometers without them, and they will adjust in an instant, the way they always do, because they have no framework for understanding that anything was missed. And yet, there is a body of observation, scattered and anecdotal and impossible to publish, that suggests the picture is not so clean. Trainers report that Pokémon who have been in a ball for a very long time come out differently. Not damaged, not sick, just quieter for the first few hours, standing very still, watching the middle distance with an attention that is not directed at anything visible. Veterinary staff at league facilities have a name for it that is not in any manual. They call it settling. They will tell you it is nothing, and most of them believe that. Trainers report that a Pokémon who is recalled while frightened comes out frightened, which the energy conversion model does not predict at all, because a state of fear is a configuration of a nervous system, and there is no nervous system in there to hold it. And trainers report, occasionally, in the small hours, in the way that people admit things they would deny in daylight, that they have opened a ball expecting one creature and had the sense, for less than a second, that something else had been about to come out. Silphco has never commented on that. There is no reason they should. It is not a claim that can be tested, and the people who make it usually laugh about it afterward. But it connects, uncomfortably, to something we walked past a long way back in this story and left standing in the dark. The sphere carved into temple walls by 3 civilizations that had never met. The vessel motif, a plain, round shape between a human and a Pokémon, appearing in Sinnoh and Johto and the deserts of Hoenn, drawn by people separated by oceans they had no ships to cross. If the destination is one place, and it was always there, then those people were not inventing the same idea independently. They were all describing the same door. And there is a version of this that goes further still, and I will set it down gently, because it is the kind of thought that grows in the dark. If that place has always existed, and if it has always been possible to send something into it, then the question is not who invented the Poké Ball. The question is whether anything was already in there before we started sending things. The apricorn tradition has a fragment that fits this and probably means nothing. Among the rules the carvers keep, there is one that is never explained, and it is this. A shell that has been carved must not be left open overnight. Not stored open, not set aside open, not abandoned on a bench with the 2 halves apart while the carver goes to sleep. If the work cannot be finished before dark, the halves are pressed together and bound with cord, and only then may the workshop be left. Ask why, and the answer is that it warps, which is true. Cured apricorn does warp if it is left unsupported. Ask again, later, after the 3rd cup of tea, when the fire has burned down and the visitor has stopped taking notes, and the answer is different. The answer is that an open door is an invitation, and that it is rude to leave one standing when you are not there to greet whoever comes through it. That is almost certainly a joke. Old craftsmen enjoy frightening young researchers. It is one of the few entertainments the profession offers. Almost certainly. Let the workshop go dark now. Let the halves lie bound on the bench with the cord around them, and the fire settling into embers, and the smell of smoke and sap in the still air. We are going to climb, in a little while, up out of the forest and the workshops and the department store shelves, all the way to the top of this history, to a single sphere sitting behind glass in a building in Saffron City. Purple, marked with a letter, and the only object ever made by human hands that has never once been refused. But that is a story for the next stretch of the night, and there is no hurry, and the dark is patient, and so are we. The Master Ball is not a better Pokeball. That is the first thing to understand about it, and it is the thing that almost everyone gets wrong. Every other sphere we have discussed sits on a single continuum. The plain ball asks once. The great ball asks 3 times, patiently. The Ultra Ball listens first, and phrases its question carefully. The specialist balls each find some angle of approach, some circumstance in which the creature is more likely to say yes. All of them are refinements of the same fundamental act, which is the act of asking. They are more persuasive, more articulate, better mannered, but they are all standing in the same doorway making the same request, and every one of them can be told no. The Master Ball does not ask. There is no query pulse. There is no sensor array reading the target. There is no rhythm of shakes on the ground, no interval during which the creature considers the offer, no moment in which anything is decided. The ball makes contact, and the capture is already complete. The light that flares from it is not the red of a question being posed. Witnesses describe it as violet, and much briefer, more like a shutter closing than a lamp coming on. And then the sphere is on the ground, still, and there is no click, because a click is the sound of an answer arriving, and no answer was required. Think about what has to be true for that to work. Every other ball in existence operates by negotiating with the will of the thing in front of it. The Master Ball does not negotiate, which means it has found a way to bypass the will entirely. It does not convince. It does not overpower, it simply removes the step at which refusal was possible. The way you might remove a page from a book so that the story goes straight from one chapter to the next without anyone noticing the gap. The engineers who built it did not set out to do that. That is the strangest part of the whole account, and the part that reads least like triumph, and most like something that happened to a group of people who were standing too close. The project began, according to the surviving internal documents, as an attempt to solve a purely commercial problem. There were creatures that could not be caught. Not difficult creatures, not rare ones, but a specific category of Pokémon on which the entire product line simply failed, every time, without exception. Trainers were spending fortunes on Ultra Balls and hurling them at a bird in the sky over Johto, and getting nothing back. From a business perspective, this was a defect. Silph Co. had built its reputation on a device that worked, and here was a class of target where it did not, and the company wanted that fixed. The research division approached it the way research divisions do. They assumed the problem was one of degree. If the query pulse was not strong enough, make it stronger. If the mechanism was not fast enough, make it faster. Generations of prototypes went out to field testers, each one more powerful than the last, and every single one of them came back with the same report. The ball struck, the light came. The creature stood in the light and looked at it, and was not interested, and the light went out, and the ball fell. They were not failing to be strong enough. They were being declined by something that did not care how strong they were. The turn came, as it so often does in this story, from someone who stopped trying to solve the stated problem. There is a memo, undated, unsigned, preserved only because it was stapled to the back of a budget request, and it contains one line that changed everything. It reads, "We are asking a question that has an answer we do not like. Stop asking." What followed was 5 years of work along a completely different axis, and the details of it are classified in a way that goes beyond ordinary corporate secrecy. What is known, or can be reasonably inferred from patent filings and the physical properties of the finished object, is that the Master Ball does not contain a stronger version of the standard mechanism. It contains a different mechanism entirely, one that has no relationship to the apricorn lineage at all. The organic residue that every other ball requires is absent. Analysis of Master Ball fragments, of which there are very few, shows no trace of it. Whatever is inside that purple shell owes nothing to a forest in Johto. Which raises the obvious question of where the design came from, and the honest answer is that nobody outside the company knows, and the theories are not comforting. The most widely repeated one holds that Silph Co. did not design the interior of the Master Ball, that they found it, that during the period in question the company was engaged in a great deal of excavation work under contract, clearing sites for construction, and, in several documented cases, sites of considerable archaeological interest, that somewhere in that work they recovered something old and round and not made by any process they recognized, and that the 5 years of secret research were not 5 years of invention, but 5 years of frantic, careful, terrified copying. This is unprovable. It is exactly the kind of story that attaches itself to any object that seems too advanced for its moment, and history is full of such stories, and almost all of them are wrong. It would explain, though, why they can only make one at a time. That is the detail nobody argues about, because it is a matter of public record, and it is genuinely bizarre. Silph Co. can manufacture ordinary Pokeballs at a rate of tens of thousands per day. They have factories on 3 continents. Their supply chain is a marvel of modern logistics. And the total number of Master Balls that have been produced since the technology was completed is a figure small enough to be written on a single line, and the rate of production has never increased, not once, despite decades of investment and every incentive imaginable. The official explanation is cost. The materials are rare, the tolerances are extreme, the process is delicate. The unofficial explanation, offered by people who have worked in that building and will discuss it only in vague terms, is that the limiting factor is not material and not machinery. It is that each one has to be finished by hand, by a very small number of people, and that those people do not stay in the role for long. They are not fired. They are not injured. They transfer, quietly, to other departments, usually after 2 or 3 years, and they do not talk about the work afterward, and the ones who have been asked about it have all said some version of the same thing in different words, which is that they did not like being in the room with it. Not with the finished ball, with the ball while it is being assembled. There is apparently a stage in the process, near the end, when the mechanism is complete, but the outer shell has not yet been closed, and something about that stage is difficult to be near. One former technician, in the only interview on the subject that has ever surfaced, said that it was like standing next to a hole in the floor of a very tall building. Nothing was happening, nothing was going to happen, You simply became extremely aware that the floor was not continuous. And so the Master Balls go out into the world, a handful at a time, and almost all of them are never used. That is the last irony of this history, and perhaps the most human thing in it. The single most powerful capture device ever created, an object that has never failed and cannot fail, an object worth more than most houses, and the overwhelming majority of them sit in cases and safes and desk drawers, unthrown. Trainers who possess one carry it for years and never bring themselves to use it, because the moment they do, they no longer have it, and there will never be another. It is too valuable to spend, so it becomes a talisman instead of a tool, an insurance policy against a moment that never quite arrives, and the trainer grows old, and the ball is passed on, or sold, or donated to a museum, still purple, still perfect, still holding its one guaranteed yes in reserve. There is something almost merciful in that, a device that removes the possibility of refusal, made in such small numbers, hoarded so carefully, that in practice, it almost never gets the chance to remove anything at all. The world produced the answer to every no, and then quietly decided it could not afford to use it, most of the time. Because there are a small number of cases, scattered thinly through the record, where somebody did use one, where a purple sphere left a hand and struck something enormous, and the violet light came and went, and the ground was suddenly very quiet. Those events are documented in the way that difficult events usually are, which is to say, incompletely, in reports that use careful language and end sooner than they should. And in more than one of those reports, the same odd note appears near the end, phrased differently each time by people who had no way of comparing accounts. The creature, in the instant before contact, did not brace itself. It did not flee, or attack, or brace, or roar. Witnesses agree that it went still, that it looked at the small purple thing coming toward it, and something in its posture changed, and the word that keeps surfacing in those descriptions is recognition. As though it had seen one before. As though, whatever Silphco found in the ground and spent 5 years copying, it was not the first of its kind, and the things that have lived in this world since before there were carvers or workshops or cities of glass and steel remember perfectly well what it is for. Let that settle. Let it sink down the way things sink at this hour, slowly, without splashing. We are near the bottom of the night now, and there is one more descent to make, back down past the factories and the temples and the sealed clay jars, all the way to the oldest question in this history, which is not how the Poké Ball was built. It is why the shape was already waiting for us when we got there. A sphere is not an obvious shape for a container. Title formats for niche.txt. Consider that for a moment, because it is one of those observations that seems trivial until you turn it over. Human beings have been making vessels for as long as there have been human beings, and almost none of them are spheres. We make bowls, which are open at the top so you can see what is inside. We make jars with flat bottoms so they will stand still on a table. We make boxes with corners because corners are easy to build and easier to stack. A sphere is the worst possible shape for a container by every practical measure. It rolls away. It cannot be set down. It cannot be filled without a funnel. It cannot be stacked at all. It is difficult to carve, difficult to cast, difficult to seal, and difficult to hold. And yet when the earliest people in this world set out to make something that could hold a Pokémon, they made a sphere. All of them did, everywhere, without exception. The apricorn is not a perfect sphere on the tree. It is lumpy and asymmetric and slightly flattened at one end, and the carvers went to enormous trouble to correct that, turning the shells on primitive lathes for hours to bring them round. Why? A hollow shell holds just as much whether or not it is symmetrical. The extra work brought nothing except roundness. They did it anyway. Every tradition did it anyway. And when the engineers in Saffron City began machining their prototypes in brass and glass and iron, they inherited the shape without ever once asking whether it was necessary. And by the time anyone thought to test the question, the industry had produced so many billions of spheres that the answer had become academic. But it was tested, eventually, because somebody always tests these things. In the middle of the last century, a research group ran a systematic study of non-spherical capture devices. Cubes, cylinders, ovoids, flattened discs, shapes chosen to preserve interior volume and wall thickness, and every other measurable property of a working ball, while abandoning the roundness. Not one of them worked, not partially, not intermittently. The failure was absolute and immediate and identical across every geometry they attempted, and it did not matter how much apricorn residue they lined the interiors with. A cube with the exact interior volume of a Poké Ball, lined with the exact same compound, thrown at the exact same Pokémon, produced nothing at all. No light. No response. The creature did not even look at it. The shape is not a convention. The shape is part of the mechanism. Something about a closed curve with no beginning and no end, no corner to catch on, no face to distinguish from any other face, is doing work that nobody has ever been able to describe. And the moment you accept that, the carvings on the temple walls stop being a curiosity and become a problem. Because those ancient artists could have drawn anything. If they were representing an abstract idea of unity, they had every shape in the world to choose from. If they were drawing a vessel from their own daily lives, they would have drawn a pot, and their pots were not round. We have the pots. They had flat bottoms and narrow necks, like pots everywhere. But between the human figure and the Pokémon figure, in Sinnoh and in Johto, and in the deep Hoenn Desert, they carved a circle. And in the versions where the circle is split, it is split along a line through its center, dividing it into two equal halves. Two hemispheres, with something between them. There is no reading of that image that is comfortable. Either three isolated civilizations independently invented not just the concept of a capture vessel, but its one functional geometry, which is possible, but requires a coincidence so large it begins to bend, or they were all looking at the same object, which means the object existed before any of them, which means somebody made it and it was not us. The archaeological consensus has settled, reasonably, on the first option. Circles are easy to draw. Round things are common. Symbols converge. This is almost certainly correct, and I would not argue against it in daylight. At this hour, though, it is worth noticing which of the two possibilities requires more from us. The coincidence explanation asks us to believe that three separate peoples, working with different materials, different languages, and different gods, all arrived at the one shape out of infinite shapes that happens to function. The other explanation asks us to believe only that something old left something behind. And there is one more thread, thin and easy to dismiss, that keeps turning up in the corner of this particular picture. In each of the three sites, the carved sphere is not being held by the human. Look at the reliefs. In the Sinnoh caverns, the human figure kneels with empty hands, and the sphere floats above and between the two figures, unsupported. In the Johto ruins, the sphere rests on the ground, and both figures face it. In the Hoenn Desert, in the oldest of the three, the sphere is held out by the Pokémon. The Pokémon is offering it. That could be a stylistic convention. It could be a translation error made with the eyes instead of the ear. It could be that the carver simply put the object where the composition needed it and thought nothing of it at all. Or the arrangement is exactly what it appears to be, and the sleeping house was not something we invented to hold them. It was something they showed us how to make. That reading turns the entire history you have just heard inside out, so gently that you might not notice it happening. Every step we have walked through tonight looks different from that angle. The apricorn trees, growing their strange hollow fruit in 7 colors on a hillside where humans happen to be living. The old rule that a sleeping house is offered and not thrown, preserved for millennia by people who could not say why it mattered. The fact that a ball placed on the ground and touched voluntarily works almost perfectly, every time, on any creature, regardless of strength, and that this method has been quietly available for the whole of recorded history, while the world built an industry on the other one. The technology has always worked best when it is used as a gift. We are the ones who turned it into a net, and perhaps that is the last thing worth carrying with you into sleep, out of all the strangeness we have moved through tonight. Not the mass that goes somewhere and comes back. Not the door and whatever waits on the far side of it. Not the purple sphere behind glass that has never once been told no. Or the room where it is assembled that people do not like to stand in. Or the 11 clay jars on their padded shelves beneath a museum in Johto with their seals unbroken. Just the small thing on your belt, 300 grams of shell and spring, and a whisper of powdered fruit from a forest nobody visits anymore. Asking, every time, in a language nobody has translated, and waiting for an answer it cannot compel. Somewhere tonight, a trainer is walking home in the dark with 6 of them, and 5 of the 6 are nowhere at all, and in the morning they will step out into the light with no memory of the distance, and they will not mind, and she will not think about it. The trees are still standing in those low green hills. The fruit is still ripening on its 4-day schedule. indifferent to us, hardening in the sun and the shade and the lightning-struck clearings. The old man is still at his lathe, with the door to the second room closed behind him. And the light comes out red and goes back in red, and the world keeps its arrangement, and nobody asks. Let it all go quiet now. Let the forest close over. Rest. There is a machine in every Pokémon Center in the world that nobody looks at. Tactic Free Transcript 8E50, WQRY 6UE-2. It sits behind the counter, humming, a low white cabinet with 6 shallow depressions in its upper surface, and a trainer walks in with 6 spheres and sets them into those depressions and stands there scrolling through messages while the lights run through their cycle. 2 minutes, sometimes 3. A soft chime. The trainer takes the balls back, thanks the nurse without really looking at her, and walks out into the afternoon with 6 healed creatures on her belt. And by the time she reaches the edge of town, she has already forgotten that the machine exists. It should not work. That is the thing about the healing machine that no one ever says out loud, and it belongs in this history because it is the second half of the Poké Ball story, the part that the carvers never imagined and could not have. The old sleeping houses did nothing but hold. You put a creature in, you took it out, and it came out exactly as it went in, injuries and all. Every wound had to be treated by hand, with poultices and splints and patience, and a badly hurt Pokémon in the old world was a Pokémon that might not survive the week no matter how good its trainer was. The healing machine repairs damage through the shell. It does not open the ball. It does not touch what is inside, because there is nothing inside to touch. It sends something down into that little sphere, and whatever it sends crosses over to wherever the creature actually is, and finds it, and mends it, and comes back. Broken bones knit, burns close, exhaustion lifts. Poison, which is a chemical fact of the blood, simply is not there anymore. 2 minutes, and a creature that could not stand is standing. Ask a technician how it works, and you will get a genuine, detailed, technically competent answer about energy restoration matrices and cellular repatterning. And the answer will be perfectly accurate about everything, except the part that matters, which is how any of it reaches through a closed door into somewhere else. The technician knows this. Every one of them knows this. It is simply not their job, and the machines are reliable, and the queue is long. There is a detail in the design that most people have never noticed. The 6 depressions are not identical. If you look closely at an older model, the kind still in service in smaller towns, you will see that each cradle has a slightly different depth, and that the differences are not random but graduated, deepest on the left and shallowest on the right. There is no functional reason for this. Modern machines have abandoned it and work just as well. The original patent explains it in a single line, and the line has never been elaborated on by anyone. It says the graduation exists to ensure that the balls are addressed in sequence rather than simultaneously. Addressed in sequence, not processed, addressed. Whoever designed that machine believed, or had been told, that it was important not to open 6 doors at once. The storage system is stranger still, and here we come to the piece of this history that people find hardest to sit with, though it is so ordinary now that children use it without a second thought. Because the 6 Pokémon limit is real, and it is enforced, and every trainer catches a 7th eventually. And when they do, the ball does not fail. The capture completes perfectly, the click comes, and then the sphere does something it has never done before. It goes cold in the hand, very briefly, and its light dims, and by the time the trainer picks it up, it is empty. The creature has been transferred. It is now in a box, in a system, on a server, in a building the trainer has never visited, in a city she may never go to. It happened in under a second, without her consent and without any mechanism she can identify, across a distance of several hundred kilometers, through a device with no transmitter and no power source capable of anything of the kind. We call it the storage system, and we treat it as a database, and the interface is designed to encourage exactly that. You look at a screen. You see little portraits in a grid. You drag one from box 11 to box 3. You rename a box and give it a wallpaper of autumn leaves. The whole thing has the emotional texture of organizing photographs. It is not a database. There is something at the other end of that transfer, and it is not a photograph. The system was built by a researcher who was, by every account, a decent and careful man, and who did not build it for this. He built it to transport. He was working on a method of moving matter between 2 fixed points, and the Poké Ball was his test case, because a ball's contents were already displaced from ordinary space, and therefore, he reasoned, easier to move. His notes from that period are cautious to the point of obsession. He tested inert objects, then organic matter, then, over a period of 2 years, a series of Pokémon, all of them volunteers, in the sense that word can be used. All of them recalled and examined afterward in exhaustive detail. Nothing went wrong. The transfers were clean. The creatures came out identical to the creatures that went in, down to the last measurable parameter. Down to the last measurable parameter. He wrote that phrase himself, in his own notes, more than once. And it is not the phrase of a man who is entirely satisfied. He kept using it, identical down to the last measurable parameter. It appears 11 times in the surviving records, and it reads less like a conclusion and more like something he was trying to convince himself was sufficient. And then, late in the work, there was the accident. You know the outline of it, even if you have never heard the details, because it has become a kind of folk story, softened by retelling into something almost comic. The researcher, working alone, at night, made a mistake with his own equipment, and was caught in the field, along with a Pokémon that happened to be in the room. The two of them were merged. For a period of some hours, he existed as something that was neither one creature nor the other, and he was found in that state, and he was restored, and he recovered fully, and he went back to work, and the system was completed and deployed, and now every trainer in the world uses it. That is the version people tell. It is accurate, as far as it goes. What the story leaves out is that he was not attempting a transfer when it happened. The equipment was not in transmission mode. He was running a diagnostic, a passive one, an examination of the channel itself while nothing was being sent through it. He wanted to look at the pathway. He wanted to see what the space between the two endpoints actually was. And something came the other way. That is not speculation on my part. It is the only reading that fits the physical evidence, and it is essentially what he wrote in the incident report before the report was sealed. The merge did not occur because he was transmitted into a Pokémon. It occurred because a pattern crossed the channel in the direction opposite to the one the machine was built for, and it arrived where he was standing, and for several hours the two of them occupied the same space, because neither had anywhere else to be. He never explained why a Pokémon that was safely elsewhere, not in transit, not in a ball in the field, would suddenly move through a passive diagnostic channel toward the only human being in the building. He also never used the word accident in his own notes. Other people used it later, in the press releases and the interviews, and he let them, and he was gracious about it, and he changed the subject when it came up. In his own handwriting, in the margin of a page that was photographed before the file was closed, he wrote 3 words about the event that have never been satisfactorily interpreted. It found me, not it reached me, not I was struck, found, which implies looking, and me, which implies a preference. He shut down that line of research entirely. Not the storage system which he finished and gave to the world for free, refusing every offer to license it, insisting that it belonged to everyone, but the diagnostics, the attempts to characterize the channel, the whole question of what the pathway is made of, that stopped, permanently, and it has never been meaningfully resumed by anyone else. The modern storage system is a mature technology maintained by engineers who keep it running beautifully and do not investigate it, because the founding document of their entire field is a set of notes by a man who looked once and did not look again. So when a trainer catches a 7th Pokémon and it vanishes from her hand and reappears as a small portrait in a grid on a screen, what has actually happened is that a creature has been moved, without asking, through a corridor whose interior nobody has been willing to examine for 50 years, into a facility that stores it in a manner nobody can describe, where it will wait. And they do wait. There is no evidence that a stored Pokémon experiences anything at all, and every reason to believe that the same absence of duration applies there as applies in a ball. A creature deposited for a decade and withdrawn comes out with no sense of having been anywhere. There is no boredom, there is no loneliness. There cannot be, because there is no interval in which to be lonely. But we know something about the boxes that does not sit easily with that, and it is a very small thing, and it is the kind of small thing that gnaws. Storage boxes are ordered. Slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, 30 slots to a box, box after box after box. The order is arbitrary. The system fills the first empty slot it finds, and every long-term storage facility in every region reports the same anomaly during routine maintenance, and has done since the beginning, and it is considered a harmless display glitch and has never been fixed because fixing it would require investigating it. The order changes. Not the data. The data is intact. Nothing is lost. Nothing is corrupted. Every creature is present and accounted for, and withdraws perfectly. But the positions shift. A Pokémon in slot 19 of box 4 is found months later in slot 2 of box 4, with no transaction logged and no user access recorded. It happens rarely, in a small percentage of long dormant boxes, and it happens more often in boxes that have not been opened in years. Analysis of the pattern was done once, quietly, as an internal exercise at a single facility, and the finding was set aside as a statistical artifact because the alternative was not useful to anybody. The finding was that when positions change in a dormant box, the creatures move closer together. There is a room in the basement of the Silphco building in Saffron City that appears on no floor plan filed with the city, and the reason it appears on no floor plan is entirely mundane. It was not built as a room, it was built as a gap. When the foundations were laid, the engineering required a void between two load-bearing structures, and somebody at some point in the intervening decades put a door on it and a light in it and began storing things there, the way people always do with a space that nobody has assigned a purpose to. What is stored there now is the failure archive. Every large manufacturer keeps one. It is not sinister. When you produce billions of a thing, some of them come out wrong, and the wrong ones are valuable because they tell you about the process. Most of the archive is exactly what you would expect. Shells that cracked during forming, seams that seated a millimeter off, hinge springs that fatigued early, row after row of small labeled trays holding small labeled failures, each with a date and a batch number and a one-line note explaining what went wrong and what was changed in response. At the back of that room, on the lowest shelf, there is a tray with no batch number. It holds 11 Poké Balls, and they are physically perfect. That is the reason they are there. Every one of them passed inspection. Every one of them meets specification in every measurable respect. Wall thickness, mass, seam tolerance, spring tension, residue concentration, mechanism response, all nominal, all within range, all indistinguishable from the balls that went into shipping crates on the same day and are out in the world right now on somebody's belt. They do not work. They have been tested, repeatedly, over years, by different teams who did not know the previous teams had tried. Thrown at Pokémon in controlled conditions, at weakened Pokémon, at sleeping Pokémon, at a Magikarp in a tank that had been anesthetized to the point of near immobility. The ball strikes. The mechanism fires correctly. You can hear the catch release. And nothing happens. No light, no query. The sphere falls to the ground with its shell open and its interior exposed, and lies there like a piece of jewelry. The note on the tray, written by hand, says, "Mechanically sound, functionally absent. Cause unknown. Do not reprocess. Do not reprocess." That is an instruction not to melt them down and put the material back into the supply, which is what happens to every other failure in that room. Somebody, at some point, decided that these 11 should not go back into circulation, and did not write down why, and everybody since has left them where they are. The obvious reading is contamination. Something in the residue batch was wrong in a way that the assays did not catch, and the balls came out inert, and the sensible thing was to quarantine the material rather than risk spreading whatever it was through the production line. That is almost certainly the correct explanation, and it is the one the company has given on the 2 occasions anyone has asked. The less obvious reading comes from the dates. All 11 were produced on the same day, in the same facility, on the same line, which supports the contamination theory neatly. But they were not produced consecutively. They came off that line at intervals, scattered through a run of some 40,000 units, and the 39,989 spheres between them were all fine. If it were a bad batch of residue, you would expect a block. A continuous stretch of failures, beginning when the contaminated material entered the mix, and ending when it ran out. Instead, there are 11 dead balls, distributed through a day's production, like raisins through a loaf. Something selected them. Or, more precisely, something about them was different before they were made, which is not a sentence that means anything. And that is exactly the problem. There is no stage in the process at which one sphere in 4,000 could be singled out. The shells are stamped from a continuous sheet. The residue is mixed in a single vat and applied by spray. The mechanisms are dropped in by machine from a hopper. At every point in the manufacture, these 11 were treated identically to everything around them, and at the end of it, 11 of them were empty in a way that the other 39,989 were not. An old carver would have an answer for this, and the answer would be useless to an engineer. And it would go something like, "Not every shell becomes a house. Some of them are only ever shells. You cannot tell by looking, and you cannot tell by measuring, and you find out when you find out." Kurt is said to lose perhaps 1 in 30 this way. He carves them, cures them, fits them, and they do nothing, and he does not seem troubled by it. He is supposed to have said that it is the same with anything you make by hand. Some of it takes, and some of it doesn't, and a person who cannot accept that should take up a different trade. The uncomfortable part is not that Silphco produces dead balls. It is the rate. 1 in 30 for a man working alone with a knife and a candle. 1 in 4,000 for a factory line, with laser calibration and automated quality control at 9 separate stages. Better, enormously better, but not zero, and never zero. And the failures are not distributed the way manufacturing failures are distributed. They are distributed the way individuals are. Move away from the basement now. Come back up into the light, out of the archives and the sealed files and the rooms nobody visits, because there is a whole side of this history that is not strange at all, and it deserves its share of the night. Pokeballs are beautiful. That is not a small thing, and it is not an accident. Somebody, very early in the industrial period, made the decision that these objects should be red on top and white below, with a dark seam and a pale button, and there was no engineering reason for any of it. The steel prototypes were unpainted. The color scheme was added at the point when the balls began to be sold to ordinary people rather than to specialists, and the internal documents from that moment are refreshingly honest about it. They wanted the object to look friendly. They wanted a child to want one. It worked so completely that the shape has become a symbol in its own right, detached from its function. You see it on flags, on the sides of buses, on the shoulder patches of rescue workers, and the tail fins of aircraft. Children draw it before they can draw a face correctly. 2 half circles, and a line and a dot, and everyone in the world knows immediately what it is. There are religious communities in the mountains of Sinnoh who use a plain, undecorated sphere as an altar object, and are quite clear that it is not a Pokeball, and equally clear about why the resemblance is not a coincidence. And people love their specific ones. That is the part that surprises researchers who come to this subject from the technical side. A Pokeball is a mass-produced object, functionally interchangeable with billions of others, and trainers become attached to particular ones the way people become attached to a particular chipped mug. They keep the ball a first partner was caught in long after it has been retired and replaced. They have them repaired rather than replaced when the shell cracks, at costs that make no economic sense. There is a small industry of restoration specialists who do nothing but bring damaged, sentimental balls back to working condition, and they will tell you their clients cry in the shop more often than you would think. There is a tradition, in several regions, of burying a ball with its owner, not the trainer, the Pokémon. When a partner dies, the ball it lived in goes into the ground with it, empty, closed, and the reasoning given is always some variation of the same thought, which is that it was where they slept, and you would not take away the place where someone slept. Sleeping house. Thousands of years, 3 languages, an entire industrial revolution, and the phrase survives intact in the instincts of people who have never heard it. And there is one more custom, smaller and quieter, practiced mostly in the old parts of Johto and in a few coastal villages in Hoenn, and it is the one that I think about most. When a trainer releases a Pokémon back into the wild, genuinely releases it, not deposits it, not trades it, but opens the ball at the edge of the forest and steps back and lets the light go out of it for the last time, they do not keep the ball. They leave it open. They set the 2 halves apart, on a rock or in the grass at the boundary of the wild place, and they walk away without closing it, and they do not go back for it. Ask why, and you will get the practical answer first, which is that an open ball cannot catch anything, and leaving it open is a promise that you will not change your mind. Ask again, later, and the older answer comes out, and it is the mirror image of the carver's rule about never leaving a shell open overnight. In the workshop, an open door is an invitation, and you do not leave one standing when you are not there to greet whoever comes through. But at the edge of the forest, at a parting, the invitation is the entire point. You leave the door open, because the door was never a cage, and because if the creature ever wants to come back, from wherever it goes, from whatever the far side of that light actually is, there should be a way, and it should be one it recognizes, and nobody should have shut it. There are places in those hills where you can find them. Old ones, moss-grown, halves lying a few centimeters apart in the leaf litter, where somebody set them down 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. Nobody moves them. Children are told not to touch them. In the same tone, children are told not to touch gravestones, and the reason given is politeness rather than fear. And every so often, walking one of those paths in the early morning, with the mist still in the low ground, someone finds one that has been closed. Not damaged, not fallen shut, because a cured apricorn shell that has been set open in damp leaves for decades does not fall shut. The halves warp apart, not together. Closed properly, seated on the seam, the way a ball closes when it has been used. The local explanation is that walkers do it. That some tidy-minded hiker comes past, sees two halves of an old ball in the grass, assumes it is litter, fits them together and sets them back down. This is a perfectly good explanation, and it accounts for nearly all of the cases. It does not account for the weight, because a closed one is heavier. Not much. A hand can barely tell. But it is heavier than an identical empty shell of the same size and material, by an amount that is small and consistent and should not exist at all, given that a Pokéball's mass does not change with its contents. Given that this is the single most reliably confirmed fact in the entire literature. Given that a sphere holding a Snorlax weighs exactly the same as a sphere holding nothing. Exactly the same as a sphere holding nothing. Unless what has come back through is not a Pokémon, and does not have mass in the way a Pokémon does not have mass, and has settled into a house it recognizes with just enough of itself left over to register on a scale. They are not collected, they are not studied. There is no institution that wants them, and no researcher who has built a career on them, and the people who live in those hills leave them exactly where they lie, closed, in the leaves, at the edge of the trees. Sleep now. The mist is coming up off the low ground, and the light is grey and level, and there is nothing on the path ahead of you but moss and old wood and the small round shapes that have been waiting there a very long time, patient as fruit, for somebody to pick them up. Nobody picks them up, and the path goes on, and a few kilometers further into those hills the trees change. Title formats for niche.txt. You notice it slowly, the way you notice most things in a forest. The crooked low apricorn trees with their heavy fruit thin out and give way to something taller and straighter, older growth. The kind of wood where the canopy closes over completely, and the light on the floor is green and dim even at noon. The ground goes soft. Sound behaves strangely. A bird calling 40 meters away sounds like it is calling from inside your own head, and your own footsteps sound like they are happening to somebody else. This is where the trees stop bearing. That is the actual, documented, entirely unmysterious botanical fact about the apricorn. It grows in a band. It requires a specific altitude, a specific soil chemistry, a specific balance of shade and light, and outside that band, the trees still grow, but the fruit comes out small and soft and hollowless, useless for carving, indistinguishable from any other unremarkable woodland fruit. Botanists have mapped the band precisely. It is a ring, roughly, following the contour of the hills, perhaps 11 kilometers across at its widest point, and it has been the same ring for as long as anyone has been keeping records. Attempts to grow apricorns outside the band have been made continuously for over a century, by hobbyists, by universities, by agricultural corporations with enormous resources and every reason to succeed. Soil has been transported by the ton, light conditions have been reproduced exactly. Cuttings, grafts, seeds, tissue cultures, controlled greenhouses matched to the parent site down to the humidity and the mineral content of the water. The trees grow perfectly well. They are healthy, vigorous, long-lived. They flower. The fruit is always hollowless, always, everywhere, in every greenhouse on every continent for 100 years. The agricultural explanation is that some environmental factor has not been identified yet. A trace element, a fungal symbiont, a particular insect that visits the flowers at a particular stage. This is very likely true, and the research continues, patiently, in the way that unglamorous research does. The other explanation is the one the carvers have always given, and they give it without any drama at all, the way you would explain that water runs downhill. They say the trees are not making a fruit. They say the trees are making a door, and a door has to be in a wall, and there is only one wall. Ask what the wall is between, and the conversation ends, not because they are being coy, but because they genuinely do not know and see no reason to guess. But the band has a center, and this is where the maps become interesting. If you take the ring of viable apricorn growth and find its geometric center, you do not land on anything. There is no clearing, no spring, no outcrop of unusual rock, no shrine. It is an ordinary patch of old forest on a gentle north-facing slope, indistinguishable from the forest around it, and people have gone looking for something there many times and come back having found nothing at all, which is exactly what you would expect if the ring is simply the natural extent of a soil type. What is at the center is a hole, not a dramatic one, not a cave mouth or a chasm, a depression in the forest floor about 2 meters across and perhaps 40 centimeters deep, filled with leaf litter, the kind of feature you would walk past 100 times without registering. Surveys have identified it as a tree throw, the pit left behind when a very large tree falls and its root plate tears out of the ground. There are thousands of them in any old forest. This is almost certainly what it is. It has been there for at least 400 years. We know this because it appears on a hand-drawn estate map from that period, marked with a symbol that the cartographer used nowhere else on the sheet, and there is no key. The local name for it, in the dialect of the hill villages, translates awkwardly. The most common rendering is the first house. A more literal reading, preferred by 1 or 2 linguists who have worked on the dialect, is the house that was already there. Nobody carves within sight of it. That is not a rule anyone states. It is simply a thing that has never happened. Workshops are scattered all through the productive band, wherever there is a road and a water source. And there is a road and a water source within 400 meters of the center, and in 4 centuries no one has ever built there. When this is pointed out to people from the villages, they tend to look mildly surprised, consider it for a moment, and then say something to the effect that it is a bit far from the good trees, which is not true, because it is closer to the good trees than most of the workshops that do exist. And there is one more thing about that patch of forest, and it is the sort of detail that survives only because somebody wrote it down for an entirely different reason. In the estate map from 400 years ago, the surveyor recorded the timber value of every part of the property, as surveyors do. Species, density, quality, estimated yield. The whole sheet is covered in his small, neat figures. Over the area immediately surrounding the depression, an area of perhaps 2 hectares, he wrote no figures at all. In the margin beside it, in the same neat hand, he wrote a note that has been transcribed, retranscribed, argued over, and finally accepted as reading: "Trees here are not to be counted, by long custom, and I have not counted them." By long custom, 400 years ago, and it was already long. Something in those hills has been left uncounted for a very long time, and the fruit that grows in a ring around it has been quietly opening doors for the whole of human history, and the people who understood the craft best always spoke about the objects they made, as though the objects were rooms in somebody else's house that they had been given permission to furnish. Let the forest hold that. Let it go dark and green and soft underfoot. Because there is another thread we have not followed yet, and it runs in the opposite direction, out of the woods entirely, and up into the thin, cold air where nothing grows at all. Not every capture tradition came from Johto. That is easy to forget, because the apricorn lineage won so completely. Every ball in every shop in every region descends from those hills, and the alternatives were absorbed or abandoned or reduced to folklore. But there were alternatives, and at least 2 of them worked, and one of them worked in a way that should not have been possible. The Hoenn desert tradition is the better documented of the 2, because the desert preserves things. There is a site in the interior, past the ash fields, where the wind has stripped the sand back from a series of low structures that were buried for millennia, and inside those structures, researchers found capture vessels that owe nothing to any fruit. They are made of glass, not worked glass. Fulgurite, the glass that forms when lightning strikes sand and fuses it into a hollow branching tube, rough on the outside, smooth as a mirror within. In the desert, this happens often enough that the material is not rare, and the people who lived there gathered it, and they selected the pieces that had formed into rough spheres, and they ground and polished them until they were true. Lightning made. Hollow because the strike made them hollow, not because anyone carved them out. Spherical because the maker chose the ones that were already close and finished the work. They function. That is the extraordinary part. 3 intact examples have been recovered, and one of them has been tested, once, under controlled conditions with an enormous amount of institutional hand-wringing beforehand, and it captured a Pokémon on the first attempt with no apricorn residue anywhere in its structure, pure fused silica, nothing organic, nothing from Johto, nothing that any theory of the mechanism can account for. It was released immediately afterward. The vessel is now in a case, and it will not be tested again, and the report on the test is 4 pages long and reads like it was written by somebody with a headache. 2 traditions, 2 materials with nothing whatsoever in common, a fruit that ripens hollow in a green forest, and sand fused by lightning in a place where nothing has grown in 10,000 years. Different continents, different peoples, different eras. Both hollow without human intervention, both spherical without human intervention, both made by the world, not by us, and both simply found and finished by hands that recognized what they were looking at. And that, I think, is the shape of the answer, if there is one. The Poké Ball was never invented. It was noticed, over and over, independently, wherever people lived alongside something that made round hollow objects on its own. Somebody picked one up and understood, by whatever means, that it was a place, and that the place was not here, and that it could be offered. The apricorn carvers built an entire priesthood around not asking why. The desert people fused nothing and polished what the sky gave them. Silphco copied a shape it did not understand, in a material chosen by trial and error, and lined it with the ghost of a forest because nothing else would work. And every one of those traditions arrived, by completely separate roads, at the same small round door. We are the only ones who ever learned to throw it. Throwing is not part of the mechanism. We have said this once already tonight, in passing, but it is worth stopping in front of it properly now, because it is the single largest gap between what a Pokéball is and what we have made of it, and everything that follows in this history grows out of that gap. There is no component in any sphere ever manufactured that requires impact. The pressure plate needs contact, a touch, a nudge, the weight of a paw. It does not need force. It has never needed force. A ball rolled gently across a floor into the side of a sleeping Pokémon works exactly as well as one hurled from 20 meters, and this has been demonstrated so many times, in so many contexts, that it is not even considered a finding. It is simply how the object behaves. And yet the throw is universal. It is the first thing every trainer learns. There are coaches who teach it. There is a whole vocabulary of technique. The underhand lob, the flat drive, the high arc that comes down out of the sun on a flying type. Championship trainers are admired for their form the way athletes are admired for theirs, and children practice for hours in back gardens with weighted training spheres, and there are companies that sell gloves for it. None of it does anything. Ask why we throw, and you get a set of answers that are all reasonable and all incomplete. Distance, obviously. The creature is over there, and you are over here, and closing that gap on foot with a wild Tauros at the end of it is not advisable. Speed, because a weakened Pokémon may recover or flee. Safety, convenience, all true. All of it accounts for perhaps half the behavior. Because trainers throw at Pokémon standing 2 meters in front of them. Trainers throw at Pokémon that are unconscious. Trainers throw, hard, at creatures lying perfectly still that could be approached at a walk and touched with an outstretched hand, and they do it without thinking about it, and if you ask them afterward why they did not simply walk over, they look at you as though you have asked why they did not eat their soup with a fork. The throw is not a technique, it is a posture toward the world. It is the difference between offering and taking, expressed in the body, and it was learned so early and so completely that it has become invisible. The old carvers saw it happen. That is the part of this history that does not usually get told, because it is not dramatic, and there are no artifacts. Only a handful of remarks written down by people who did not think they were recording anything important. There is a letter, from the early industrial period, written by a woman from one of the hill families to a relative who had moved to the city. Most of it is family news, weather, a dispute about a fence. And then, near the end, almost as an aside, she describes having seen trainers from the coast passing through with the new steel balls, and she describes watching one of them catch a Pokémon on the road below her workshop. She writes that she did not understand what she was looking at first, that the man wound a key and shouted and threw, and that the thing on the road went into the ball while it was still trying to get up. And then she writes one sentence about it that is the whole of the modern world in miniature. She writes, "It did not occur to him to wait, and I do not think it had ever occurred to him, and I found that I could not explain to myself why it should. That is the moment. not the invention, not the factory, not the price tag. The moment when a person who had spent her life inside a tradition of waiting stood at a window and discovered that she could no longer articulate what the waiting had been for. Within 2 generations, the carvers were a curiosity. Within 3, they were nearly gone. The knowledge did not die because anyone destroyed it. It died because it stopped being able to justify itself in the only language that was still being spoken. A hand-carved ball took a week to make and asked a question that could be refused. A factory ball took 9 seconds and could be thrown at something that was already on the ground. Nobody chose the second thing over the first. It simply became the only obvious option, one small reasonable decision at a time, until the alternative had no words left to be described in. And the strange, quiet consolation buried in all of this is that the object never changed. That is what I keep returning to. Every ball on every shelf in every shop in the world still contains its trace of that forest, still asks its question, in whatever language it asks it, still waits for an answer it cannot compel. The mechanism did not become a weapon. It was never redesigned to overpower anything. The Master Ball is the sole exception in the entire history of the technology, and there are so few of them, and almost none of them are ever thrown. What changed was the arm. The ball is still, at bottom, a door with a doorbell on it. It rings, and something on the other side decides, and if that something is exhausted and hurt and frightened, then it is more likely to say yes. And we found that out very early and built an entire civilization on it. But the yes is still a yes. That is not nothing. Something in the design refused, quietly, across thousands of years and every attempt to improve it, to become a thing that takes. We got around it. We got around it by making sure the answer was never really in doubt. But we never got through it. And there is a version of that thought that is almost hopeful if you hold it the right way in the dark. Every Pokémon walking beside a trainer tonight, in every region, on every road, every single one of them, at some point, was asked. Perhaps not fairly. Perhaps at the worst moment of its life, on its side in the grass with its breath coming wrong and a stranger standing over it. But it was asked, and it answered. And the answer was yes. And there is no mechanism in the world that could have produced that yes, if the thing inside had truly, wholly, in whatever way such creatures decide things, chosen otherwise. That is why the bond is real, not because of the technology. In spite of it, the ball does not create loyalty. There is no component for that, and every attempt to engineer one has failed as completely as the cubes and the cylinders failed. What the ball does is ask once, badly, under bad conditions, and everything that comes afterward, the years of walking, the shared meals, the sleeping in the same room, the moment on a mountainside when one of them steps in front of the other without being told to. All of that is built on nothing but a single ambiguous yes, given a long time ago, by something that could not have known what it was agreeing to. And it holds anyway. Overwhelmingly, across billions of partnerships, it holds. Rest with that a while. The road is long, and the light is low, and there are 6 small spheres on a belt somewhere, warm from body heat, waiting to be opened in the morning. And in the morning, they are. That is where this history actually ends, if you follow it all the way down past the archives and the sealed jars and the uncounted trees. Not in a laboratory, not in a temple. In the very ordinary moment, repeated some hundreds of millions of times every single day across this world, when a person who is not fully awake yet reaches down to a belt or a bag or a bedside table, presses a small button with a thumb, and stands back while the light comes out. It is worth watching that light properly at least once, because most people never do. They press and turn away and start the kettle. But if you stand still and look at it, the release is a slower thing than the capture, and it has stages, and the stages are the same every time no matter what is coming out. First, the button gives. There is a fraction of a second between the press and anything happening at all, a hesitation that engineers have never quite designed out, and which is not a delay in the mechanism, because the mechanism is instantaneous. Then the shell opens along the seam, and the light comes, and it is not a beam. That is a misconception created by photography, which freezes the middle of the process. The light comes out as a shape. It emerges already roughly the size and form of the creature, faint and red and edgeless, hanging in the air for perhaps a third of a second like a held breath. And then it resolves, from the ground upward, always from the ground upward, feet or coils or roots first, head last. And there is a small displacement of air. and something alive is standing in a place where nothing was standing before. Head last. Nobody knows why. It is consistent across every species, every ball type, every region, and it has been filmed at 10,000 frames per second and confirmed. Whatever is on the other side of that door, things come through it feet first, the way you would step down into a room, or the way a person climbs out of water. And then they look around. Every one of them does this, every time. A Pokémon released into a place it has been released into 1,000 times will still, in the first moment, turn its head and check. It takes less than a second, and it is so universal that trainers stop seeing it. Behavioral researchers have catalogued it under orientation response and explained it as a straightforward re-establishment of spatial awareness after an interruption in sensory input, which is a completely sound explanation and is very probably the whole of it. It is only that the phrase in the old dialect for this exact moment, the one the hill villagers use, does not mean orientation. It means the looking for. They do not specify what is being looked for. When pressed, the older people will say that it is not a question that has an answer, and that it is simply what a thing does when it comes back into a room, and that you would do the same. You would, of course. Anyone would. That is the thing about all of these small strangenesses we have walked through tonight. The sequenced healing cradles, the boxes where positions drift closer together, the open balls in the leaf litter that are heavier when they are closed, the 11 perfect spheres on the lowest shelf that do not work. Every single one of them has a reasonable explanation, and the reasonable explanations are almost certainly correct, and I have tried to give them to you honestly each time, rather than leaving them out for effect. What I cannot do is make them stop accumulating, because that is what happens when you follow this object all the way back. You start with something completely mundane, a plastic sphere from a shop, 300 grams, sold in packs of 10, and you ask a simple question about where the mass goes, and the answers are always adequate and never quite sufficient, and the inadequacies are always small, and there are always more of them the further back you walk, through the factories, through the steel ball with the winding key, through the workshops full of smoke, and the burials with 3 shells set around a skull, and the sealed jars beneath a museum, and the carvings on 3 continents made by people who never met, until eventually you are standing at the edge of a shallow depression in an old forest that nobody has counted the trees around for 400 years, and you have run out of history to walk through. And the object in your hand has not changed at all. It is still just a sphere. It still fits in a pocket. It still asks its one question, in a language nobody has translated, and waits. There is a thought that the very last of the carvers are supposed to pass on, at the end of the 40 years, when the apprentice has finally been left alone in the workshop with the lathe and the candle and the smell of sap. It is not a secret, it is not a technique. Every version of it that has been recorded is slightly different, because it was never written down, and it goes roughly like this. You are not making a cage, and you are not making a tool. You are making a room in a house that you have never seen, in a place that you will never go, for a guest who did not ask to be invited. Make it well, make it round, and make it even, and hold it up to the light until the glow is the same all the way around. And when it is finished, set it down in front of whoever it is for, and step back and let them decide. That is the whole of the craft. Everything else, the 7 colors, the 4-day windows, the smoke and the cord and the rules about rain, is detail hung on that single instruction, and the instruction survived intact for thousands of years, through an industrial revolution and a legal revolution and the near total extinction of the people who kept it, and it is still, quietly, physically true of every sphere manufactured today. Set it down, step back, let them decide. We stopped doing the first 2 parts a very long time ago, but the third one is not ours to remove, and nobody has ever managed to, and the one device that came close is so rare and so strange and so difficult to be near that the world has quietly agreed to leave it in its case. So here is where we leave it, as the night thins out and the window goes from black to grey. Somewhere in the hills of Johto, the trees are standing in the dark with their fruit hardening on the stem, indifferent, hollow, waiting for a 4-day window that will come and go, whether or not anybody is there to notice it. Somewhere in a desert, lightning is striking sand and making glass tubes that nobody will polish. Somewhere in a basement in Saffron City, there is a tray with no batch number on the lowest shelf, and 11 perfect spheres in it that never became anything, and the light in that room is off. Somewhere, a server hums in a facility nobody visits, holding thousands of creatures in a place we have agreed not to look at, none of whom have any idea how long it has been. And in Box 4, everything is exactly where it should be. And somewhere much closer, on a bedside table or a windowsill or the floor beside a pair of boots, there are 6 small round doors, closed, warm, quiet, with 5 friends behind them, and one asleep on the end of the bed. In a few hours, somebody will press a button, and the shell will open along its seam, and the light will come out slowly and resolve from the ground upward, and something alive will stand in a place where nothing was standing before. It will turn its head. It will look around the room, briefly, for whatever it is that they always look for. It will find it. And the 2 of them will go out into the morning together, down a road that has been walked by more people and more creatures than anyone could ever count, carrying between them an object that neither of them understands, that was never invented, that was only ever noticed, and that has been asking the same patient question since before there was anyone here to answer it. Sleep well. Rest now. The door is open, and it is only a room, and there is nothing in the dark but a hillside full of trees that nobody is counting. Good night.